The Mediterranean's power dynamics were set to be put to the ultimate test by the spring of 1565. The Ottoman Empire, which spanned 3 continents, was on one side and was ruled by the elderly but still powerful Suleiman the Magnificent. The Knights Hospitaller, a rebellious fraternity of warriors who had spent decades sabotaging Ottoman trade and prestige, controlled the little island citadel of Malta. Suleiman was at last at his breaking point. To finally vanquish the Knights, he would dispatch his most trusted commanders, Mustafa Pasha, Admiral Payale Pasha, and the fabled corsair, Turgut Reis. One of the most valiant and desperate sieges in history would ensue, a conflict that would determine the Mediterranean's own destiny. At 71, Suleiman the Magnificent was a living legend. However, he was also worn out. He was fed up with the Christian corsairs and their persistent raids of his critical maritime lanes by the bothersome Knights of St. John. Malta had served as their ideal base for many years, a dagger pointing directly at the Mediterranean's throat. Their privateering efforts had made it a strategic choke point and a continual source of annoyance for the Sultan. The path to Sicily would be open if you took Malta. Take Sicily, and the already fractured center of Christian Europe would fall apart like a shabby, neglected rug. There was a history of disobedience among the knights themselves. They had been granted Malta by Emperor Charles V on one important condition, and Suleiman himself had forced them to leave their former stronghold on Rhodes in late 1522 and set out in early 1523. To act as a barrier against Ottoman expansion, they had to patrol the sea lanes. Eliminating them from the map was more than simply a strategic need for Suleiman. It was so intimate. They grabbed every Christian galley. They directly challenged the Sultan's holy mandate by harassing every Muslim pilgrim ship, which was an insult to his enormous dignity. Territories weren't the issue here. It has to do with honor. He therefore put together a force that was genuinely biblical in scope. The largest amphibious assault since ancient times. We're talking about 25,000 to 30,000 crack troops, 180 transport ships loaded with men and supplies, and 130 beautiful battle galleys, not to mention the camp followers, engineers, artillery specialists, and one particularly irate and crafty corsair admiral named Dragut, whose reputation was legendary before he was even born. This was the Ottoman Empire's power unleashed. Grand Master John de Volay, a seasoned warrior in his late 60s, struggled to make ends meet among this overwhelming tide. The Order's top fighting force, 500 knights, formed his corps. Then came roughly 3,000 Maltese militia, farmers, and townspeople, many of whom had little to no military experience, and about 4,500 European mercenaries, primarily from Spain and Italy. However, they had enough gunpowder for perhaps 6 weeks if they were careful. Since they had everything to lose, the probabilities are about 10 to 1. Furthermore, the Ottomans undoubtedly had superior cuisine. Let's face it. It appeared to be inevitable, didn't it? The date that is inscribed in Maltese history is May 18. Ottoman spies paddled into Marsalak Bay in their little boats, gliding soundlessly. The Ottoman land commander, Mustafa Pasha, was extremely self-assured. In a matter of days, he fully expected the knights to sue for peace, maybe even hours. He expected a quick, resounding triumph. Instead, he discovered star-shaped forts that had recently been reinforced, were armed with artillery, and occupied by an enemy that didn't seem to want to give up. He had not anticipated this kind of reception. Mustafa understood he needed to secure the deep water anchoring inside Grand Harbor to meet his ambitious schedule. That meant capturing Fort St. Elmo, a small, nearly inconsequential fortress that sat perilously on the peninsula at the edge of the sky. It appeared to be a small challenge, a simple annoyance. Grand Master de Volay, however, silently realized that St. Elmo was disposable due to his brutal pragmatism.
For every Ottoman hour spent pounding its walls, a valuable week was purchased for the more vital fortifications of Bieru and Sangaela, as well as the remainder of the island. It was a harsh but necessary calculation. The Turks continuously battered the fort for almost 30 torturous days. They fired a barrage of 80-pound cannonballs, converting the soil into craters and stone into dust. With desperate inventiveness, the knights who were confined inside St. Elmo's collapsing walls responded. They had carried out bold raids at night, launching flaming tar hoops down the slopes, igniting the Ottoman siege towers and casting a horrible flame over the night. On both sides, the number of casualties increased, a bloody total that appeared to increase exponentially every hour. The smell of death, smoke, and gunpowder filled the air. The Ottomans were then dealt a crushing setback. During a reconnaissance mission in late June, Dragut, the renowned 80-year-old Corsair king, a terrible warrior and a great strategist, was severely wounded by a stone shard. His passing on or around June 23rd dealt the besiegers a devastating psychological blow that sapped their spirits. Nevertheless, on June 23rd, the fort ultimately fell. At a terrible cost, the Ottomans had acquired a ruin, a fractured rock patch barely larger than 4 football fields. A strategic location that had bought the defenders crucial time resulted in the deaths of between 2,000 and 4,000 of their soldiers. Furious at the sudden opposition and the significant losses, Mustafa gave the order to have the knights' bodies decapitated. Their bodies bobbed horribly on planks across the harbor, a terrifying message. De Vallet's answer was quick, cruel, and just as terrifying. He gave the order for his Ottoman prisoners' heads to be fired back from Bieru's fortifications. It had become a personal siege. Territories were no longer the issue. It was a test of wills and a blood feud. In addition to the intense Mediterranean heat, July also brought with it a crippling sense of hopelessness.
Hope, food, and water. Once valuable resources, they now ran dangerously short inside the stricken walls of Senga and Burgu. The Ottomans pressed their attack with increased vigor and grim determination after learning from their expensive victory at St. Elmo. Skilled and unrelenting, Ottoman miners started digging tunnels beneath the bastions in an effort to get past the defenses from below. The Maltese, however, were as ingenious. The defense was joined by women, children, and elderly men who carried clay pots filled with olive oil and then poured the viscous liquid into the moats. The oil was burned, turning the moats into rivers of fire when the assailants eventually waded through. A genuinely terrifying sight that turned many away from the attack. Under a sky illuminated by the flickering flares of conflict, every night, the dead were counted on both sides. Only the moans of the injured and the far-off cries of the enemy broke the stillness. Mustafa launched a large coordinated attack on August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, which is typically a day for serious celebration. The attack struck both Burgu and Senga at the same time. Dozens of scaling ladders made their way to the ramparts, and the conflict was a frenzied hand-to-hand scuffle that lasted for 3 gory, vicious hours.
De Vallet, a 70-year-old man of extraordinary determination, was spotted battling at the breach while fully armored, holding a cross in one hand and a sword in the other. That day our Lord was portrayed as an enraged grandmaster by a knight who saw the grandmaster's ferocious presence. The weary defenders were inspired by his presence and his unwavering unwillingness to give up. The Ottomans somehow left another 3,000 dead outside the walls when they departed. However, the siege was having other effects. Once a representation of their vast numbers, their tents now overcrowded every valley and served as havens for illness. Heatstroke and dysentery started to finish what cannonballs couldn't. The defense, however, was also at its breaking point. Their last loaf of food was now being divided 9 ways, and they were down to their last barrels of water.
The murmurs of hopelessness became more intense. Don Garcia de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy in Sicily, heard the dire news and thought the island was doomed. Nevertheless, he put together a relief force in spite of all the odds and the counsel of many. 35 galleys were laden with 8,000 men. He then waited for anything that may give them a chance, such as the correct wind or divine intervention. Then, at daybreak on September 7th, a tiny fleet, almost unthinkably tiny, slipped into Meliahabai with a whisper on the wind and a gleam of hope. It was the renowned Gran Saxo, a relief army with over 8,000 soldiers. However, the red and yellow flag of Spain was carried, which was far more powerful than its numbers. When Ottoman scouts saw the banner, they became immediately alarmed. Was this it? Was this an armada led by the Holy League? A huge Christian counteroffensive they had not expected? Demoralized already, Mustafa Pasha, with only 10 days' worth of supplies left, he took a desperate risk. In an attempt to destroy the remains of the resistance before the whole force of Europe, as he envisioned it, fell upon him, he ordered one more full-scale mass attack. However, it was too late. His men's spirit was crushed. Within an hour, the attack was unsuccessful. His elite janissaries, the Ottoman Empire's dreaded shock troops, just wouldn't go back up the ladders. They had lost too many battles and witnessed too many deaths at the hands of these obstinate, hopeless defenders. It was the inconceivable. On September 11th, devastated and completely disheartened, the Turks set fire to their tents, spiked their last cannon to prevent the enemy from using them, and sailed out. After 4 painful months of holding its breath, Europe finally let out a breath. From Madrid to Warsaw, there was a communal sigh of amazement and triumph, and the relief was evident. The price was high. The Ottomans suffered terrible losses, perhaps more, at least 10,000 dead, a terrible butcher bill. The Maltese suffered equally heartbreaking losses. Along with 250 of the knights, who were the backbone of their defense, a third of the island's inhabitants had died. However, the psychological impact of this triumph was much greater than the actual number of casualties. For the first time since the fall of Constantinople, a rock, a few zealots, and an almost superhuman reluctance to compromise had defeated the ostensibly inexorable Ottoman superpower. Not a large army. It severely altered the Mediterranean's geopolitical environment and dispelled the idea of their invincibility. With his trademark wit, Voltaire would go on to say, "Nothing is more known than the Siege of Malta." And he was entirely correct. Europe was quickly captivated by the victory. In Antwerp, the prince of the siege flew off the presses. Epic poems were written by poets who likened the legendary Leonidas of Sparta to the unstoppable De Valle.
Rejuvenated and full of prestige, the knights started rebuilding their capital, renaming it Valletta. This magnificent, painstakingly constructed metropolis is still the first planned city in Europe north of the Alps.
It served as a permanent sign of victory and a monument to their defiance. More significantly, Italy and the center of Western Europe were never again in grave danger from the Ottoman tide. Stung by this humiliating loss, the empire started to change course. It got involved in the never-ending, grueling battles for control of Hungary, and its aspirations shifted southward toward North Africa and eastward toward Persia. Their growth had taken a different turn after the psychological damage in Malta prompted a strategic reassessment. The triumph became a pivotal event in Malta's national identity and the island's foundation story. Local heroes from the siege are still honored in every parish on the island. Additionally, every Maltese youngster is taught the astounding cost of independence, which is reflected in the island's limestone and their forefathers' blood. Donations poured in from all across Christian Europe, from Madrid to Kyiv, to the knights who had been on the brink of bankruptcy before to 1565. As evidence of their restored might, their resurgent navy would go on to thwart Barbary pirates and Ottoman shipping for another 2 centuries. According to mythology, Suleiman, the glorious sultan whose lofty aspirations had been so completely dashed, died the very next year on another muddy battlefield in Hungary. It is said that he mumbled, "Malta, Malta," demonstrating the extent of his wounds from the defeat. Therefore, keep this in mind the next time you believe that statistics speak for themselves, or that sheer might always win. 3,000 gallant farmers, 500 knights, and a 70-year-old leader who would not give up the keys to Europe. They won more than a battle. They transformed a small map dot into the shield of a continent. They unequivocally demonstrated that even the most overpowering force history can hurl at you can occasionally be stopped by a powerful concoction of grit, strategic geography, and a dash of holy stubbornness. Of all, history is filled with pivotal conflicts, massive engagements involving armies of troops and enormous artillery parks. But the truly extraordinary one, Malta 1565, was determined by sheer resolve, wrapped in chainmail and driven by an unwavering belief rather than by overwhelming numbers. You may need to check your pulse if it doesn't inspire you to delve a little further into the dusty, forgotten corners of the past. Additionally, press the like button while you're at it. Please subscribe and tell this tale to someone who should hear it. Because someone, somewhere, will need to be reminded that even the smallest wedge can keep the door open the next time it appears as though it will smash shut.